Any questions from last time? Yes.
I watched the video that you put up about the oil well.
Yeah.
Can you explain how that works? Because I was trying to look at it to see if I could see how it
The
works.
oil derrick, the
Yeah.
thing that was going up. Now that was so that was a trip I took with those students you saw in there were LR students. So that was in Kansas. And as far as I know, there's a well next to one of those. So there was kind of a lever arm and a well with basically a pumping action. And with each pump, some oil gets pulled up. Okay. So that's just a little prelude to the next chapter. Good. Thank you for asking. I'm sure, I don't know that we're really going to get through all of this, but it'll be a prelude to the rest of the week. So, yes.
So, like, when we're doing our capstone here, it has to be something from this class, or like
Something
subject.
something related to the environment in some way. Yeah. Which is actually pretty broad. So, what we can do is start talking about things that you're interested in and see how we can make it related to the environment. So let's say you're interested in dietary limitations for Americans, or you're nursing, right? Yeah. So there's lots of things in healthcare that are related to the environment. So if people were to walk to work instead of driving, what kind of health benefits would that have? That has an energetic component to it as well. So you'd be surprised how we can tweak things, just basic interests that you have, and make them. You won't have to make them environmental. Everything's environmental in one way or another, which is, I think one of the things that hopefully we'll be getting out of this class. So. There we go. Okay, so here's where we left off last time, right? We finished all this, kind of went through this procedure, talked about hypotheses that don't get falsified, and if they don't get falsified, we talked about that, didn't we? Okay. Then eventually we start calling them theories, but they still have the characteristics of a hypothesis, still have to be falsified. Okay, so I'd like to get into a little bit more detail. Here's just a cool picture of somebody doing science. Would you like to be doing that? We teach scuba here at LR. Get scuba certified and go do cool experiments like this. That person looks like they're monitoring coral health.
Is that a camera?
Yeah, that's a camera, that's a little quadrat that they have there. So this looks like this is a little sampling procedure where they're randomly choosing, I don't know if they're randomly, I don't know this particular study, but if I were doing this, you might have particular spots in various coral heads, and you say pick 30 spots randomly and measure the percentage of diseased versus healthy coral. I'm totally making this up, but that could very well be what they're doing. And then you go back month after month and see how the percentage changes in pristine coral areas versus impacted coral areas off the coast of Florida, for example. There. Okay. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into the actual process of experimentation. And when you're doing experiments and you're generating data or facts, there's just some terminology that you should be familiar with. So first of all, a variable is any condition that can change. So let's take height in this, height in this classroom. Okay, that's one variable, and it's changeable because if I measured everyone's height here, it would change. It would be different. So it would be changing. So a variable is basically just some value, some measure that has variation to it. Typically, when you're involved with manipulative experiments, okay, so remember the example that we had of the great blue herons were visiting some docks, or a great blue heron was visiting one group of docks and not other docks. And that was essentially just a descriptive study. But then we immediately started asking why. And once you start asking why, you're into hypothesis generation. And you quickly came up with 3 or 4 hypotheses very quickly. So that variable that you can see needs explaining is called the dependent variable. The dependent variable is a variable that may depend on the independent variable. This is what you're trying to explain. Where'd you go? I didn't even see you leave. Okay. So the location pattern of our great blue herons was our example. That's what we're trying to understand. Why are they some places, not others? The independent variable is that variable which may or may not be influencing the pattern of where you see great blue herons. So you came up with a number of possible independent variables. So prey, prey distribution, territory, human disturbance, territory of other blue herons, etc. And the act of doing the experimentation is where you actually are testing to see which, or could be multiple of these, could be influencing that. Okay, probably you've gotten this in other classes before, somewhere. The way it's usually presented would be somebody's testing some drug, and does that drug have a positive benefit on some condition? So the condition is what the dependent variable is, and the drug is the independent variable. So does the independent variable influence the dependent variable? You can look at this in sort of two kinds of experiments. And manipulative experiments, which I'll just get into in a minute here in a little bit more detail. We'll talk about the natural experiments first. In a natural experiment, by the way, the great blue heron example that we're talking about, that's a natural experiment. Okay? They show real-world complexity. That is to say, those are real birds out there doing real things. They're behaving in certain ways, and we're simply monitoring them. Oops, what happened? This thing isn't on a timer. We use existing conditions to test the predictions, so we have little control over other variables. So, good example of that, you know, you have the idea of more fish at one dock versus the other dock. So you go do your fish sampling, right? And you sample, you know, one dock on Monday and Tuesday, and the other docks on Wednesday and Thursday. Well, what if the weather conditions are different in those two situations? Or even going from one time of day to the next time of day, you can't control everything in a natural experiment. And there's generally a little bit more uncertainty in the results. This is typical for most environmental science and most ecology. Okay? Manipulative experiments, you can also think of those as rigorously controlled experiments or experiments that are done in the laboratory where you can control as many of the variables as possible. And because you have more control over variables, you have more certainty in actually understanding the underlying causes of those explanations. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about those manipulative experiments. So what we're really talking about here is a controlled experiment. And a controlled experiment is one where you have the ability to take the subjects that you're using in the experiment and put them into two separate groups. One is called a control group, and the other is called the experimental group. Okay, so an experimental group is the group of organisms that receives the independent variable. Okay, so the great blue heron study wouldn't be the greatest for this, but let's say that you're interested in testing a drug on, let's say it's a diet pill. Okay. So your dependent variable would be weight loss. And your independent variable would be the diet pill. And you want to know, you're developing this diet pill. Does this diet pill influence weight loss? Okay. So the experimental group would be that set of individuals that gets the diet pill. And you always compare the experimental group with the control group. Why do you include a control group? Well, control group is a group that doesn't get the diet pill. I mean, why don't you just give a bunch of people the diet pill and see what happens to their weight? Yeah, Tucker.
Because you have to have a general, you have to have something that you can always compare it to.
Right. So let's say that you do get some weight change in the people that you give the diet pill, but you don't know if that weight change might be just a regular weight change. This happens, you know, it could be that, I don't know, Mardi Gras is coming up and they're getting ready to be beach season. So people are losing weight just so they can get into their bathing suits. You know, so you have to have a group that you compare your experimental group with. So the control group gets everything is treated exactly the same way as the experimental group, except it doesn't get the diet pill. All right? So now let's say that we're running this experiment. So I use you folks as the classroom and as the experiment, and I take all the women in the classroom and I put them into the control group, and I take all the men in the classroom and put them into the experimental group. So all the guys are going to get the diet pill, and all the gals are not going to get the diet pill. Is that a well-designed experiment?
No.
Why?
That women weigh differently as well as eat in different quantities, and there's a lot of other factors.
Yeah, it could be that it's actually gender that's influencing your, I mean, because how many different things could influence weight loss? Exercise, metabolism, height, I mean, there's any number of variables. So you want to make sure when you design your study that the only thing that's varying between the experimental and the control group is your independent variable. Everything else has to be kept equal, or as equal as you can get it. So I want to put equal numbers of men and women into my control and experimental groups. All right? All those other variables are called controlled variables. Okay, so you got to get that distinction between controlled variables and the control group. Okay, control group is a set, particular group of controlled variables. Those are variables. So these are all the other things that I want to make sure are the same between my control and experimental groups, so that I know I can't use those, or those won't be influencing the dependent variable. Does that make sense? Fairly straightforward. This method of highly rigorously controlled experiments is very powerful, because oftentimes you can whittle it down to a particular variable as it affects a dependent variable. Generally, these things are done in the laboratory. So now there are some things in environmental science where you might do something like this. So you have some toxin. You presume that there's a toxin maybe in your plastic water bottle that might be influencing something. So you take that chemical into the lab and you could then test it. And then if you see a difference in the laboratory, you might say, well, out there in the real world, you could then do a natural experiment and look to see people who use the water bottles and people who don't. Why isn't that as rigorously controlled? You do a laboratory experiment, you get rats. You have some suspected toxin that has an adverse health effect. So then half the rats get that toxin, the other half don't. And let's say the toxin comes in plastic water bottles, okay? And you say, wow, these rats over here, they die earlier, they develop more cancer, they've got all these other problems. Gosh, this is a problem. Now I go to the human population and I find all the people who use these water bottles and all the people who don't. And then I look at disease incidence in those two groups. Why is that not as good an example, or why would my evidence not be as strong in that case?
Other things could have caused their disease.
What-
The people could have gotten sick or their disease from other things other than the water bottles.
Right. And then if I'm out, go ahead.
Even the family, it could be part of the family.
Something,
Yeah.
yep,
Medical, I can't remember what it's called. You know what I'm talking about, right?
yeah, medical history.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those are freely choosing, well, first of all, there's the rat-human divide. So just because it causes problems in rats doesn't mean it's going to cause problems in humans. But then out in the population, I let's say, like these particular water bottles. And maybe certain types of people choose those water bottles. And I have some other factors that, maybe I'm a couch potato, and couch potatoes tend to buy those particular water bottles. So it could be the fact that I'm a couch potato that's causing my problems and not necessarily those water bottles. So that's kind of the distinction between a natural experiment and a manipulative experiment. Is there are other things that might co-vary with my choice of that water bottle that I can control when I'm in a laboratory experiment. Of course, the downside is we generally don't experiment on people. That's a good thing. All right, that's why so many people use rats. Okay. Very quickly, generally once you get your results and you either support your hypothesis or you reject your hypothesis, if you feel pretty confident about that, you typically write it up into a scientific paper. And then that scientific paper gets sent out among other people who were studying the same thing. And they read it. And they generally, one of two things happens, two general categories. Some aspect of the paper is so flawed that just start over. Don't even bother. So it doesn't get published. So you have to basically go back to the drawing board and start over. Or it gets accepted. There's sort of a couple of subcategories within here. Usually, most papers you have to tweak them a little bit, modify them. Your peers will say, I'd like you to restructure this paragraph, write that a little bit differently, or could you kind of analyze your data just a little bit differently? I'd like to see something else from that data. And it's accepted, but you have to do a couple of extra things to get it accepted. And then it gets into publication, and then you guys can read it. And you're out there, and other peers, it's thrown into the hopper of scientific investigation, and that generally spurs more questions and observations, and that's really kind of how science progresses. So that's an important addendum there. It's not all objective because your peers are people. We try to be as objective as possible, but oftentimes subjective thoughts and ideas creep into science, particularly as it has to do with what sorts of things you're interested in. Global warming is really hot now. It's easy to get research money. Well, it's never easy to get research money, and things are generally tight. But if you're studying mosses or global warming, you're probably more likely to get support for global warming because everybody's talking about it. So there's a sociological aspect to science. Things are they're fads. That's not all that objective. That's pretty subjective. Let's see, why don't we watch this little thing about experiment.
Where do cells come from? Scientists in the 1800s proposed an answer to this question by stating that all organisms are made of cells, and all cells arise from pre-existing cells. This hypothesis, later to become the cell theory, was a direct challenge to an alternate hypothesis called spontaneous generation. Scientists design experiments to test the validity of hypotheses. Where do cells come from?
Okay, we got that.
Scientists in the 1800s proposed an end. Louis Pasteur designed what is now a classic experiment to test the hypothesis of spontaneous generation. He created two treatment groups, a broth that was exposed to a source of cells and a broth that was not. For his control treatment, Pasteur used a straight-necked flask to separate the broth from the surrounding air. For his experimental treatment, Pasteur used a swan-necked flask. The neck shape and length assured that no cells were entering the flask from the air.
I guess they couldn't put it in one file.
Pasteur then performed the same procedure on these two flasks. He boiled the broth and allowed it to sit for several days, after which he checked for the growth of any organisms. Pasteur found living organisms only in the control flask. Because the experimental flask remained sterile, the hypothesis of spontaneous generation was rejected. By changing a single variable, the shape of the flask, Pasteur was able to conclude that cells were not generated spontaneously, but were actually entering the broth from the surrounding air.
Those flasks, they're fairly famous. They're still in the Museum of Science in Paris, back from the 1800s. I don't know how they keep them from dehydrating, but yeah.
You know why they use broth?
Broth, because bacteria grow on broth. So, because what people used to do is they would like make some beef soup, and they'd leave it out, and suddenly they'd see all these like nasty stuff growing in it, and they thought that it just spontaneously grew out of the broth. Whereas Pasteur's idea was, it's not the broth that gave rise to those organisms, but some little germs floated in from the air and landed in the broth. And so this is the idea that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So by making a flask here, he had the broth, so if they actually were spontaneously generated, then he would expect microorganisms in both flasks, okay, if it came just from the broth. But he never got any growth here, because anything that floated in from the air settled at the bottom here, and it could never get over this hump and actually land in there and start growing.
That little dip right there,
Yeah.
and that was, he done that because he wanted to see, he wanted to test that. I mean, was there liquid in that little net?
No, that's dry, completely dry. If there was liquid, he'd get growth there, because the little microscopic cells can fall in from the air and land there.
So was it enough to just close it off?
Huh?
It wasn't enough just to
He
close
wouldn't
it?
just close it off, because he also wanted to see if the air had anything to do with it. Because then if he closed them off, he'd be creating conditions in this one different than in the conditions in the other one. If he boiled the other one and then quickly closed it off, he doesn't get any growth, because nothing comes in from the top. So this was a widely held, people used, that's another example of those paradigm shifts. People used to think that life just pops into existence from nothing. People used to think that after it rains, that the ground grows mice, and mice just sort of spontaneously pop out of moist earth. It looks that way. That's sort of what you see. So, good example of a hypothesis. You can't see those cells, so that's kind of the hidden physical reality, as opposed to what you actually can see is the growth there. Okay, so we talked about this. I've never heard of that term, wicked problems. That sounds like something that comes
Sounds
from
like a Boston
Massachusetts. People in Massachusetts use the word wicked.
Wicked ridiculous.
That's wicked. Okay, we're going to kind of jump over that a little quickly. I'm going to get to that in a second. What am I talking about next? I'm talking about ecological footprints. Okay, so how many of you ever been on a diet? Anybody ever dieted in here? Okay. How many calories, when you're on a diet, you reduce the number of calories you take in, right? How many calories do you need in a day? Anybody know? Don't I have exercise people in here? Huh?
What do you mean? It depends on what you're doing.
General average, 2,400. Yeah,
I think 2,000.
I think it depends upon, you know, how tall you are, how much you weigh.
Well, unlike the nutrition label, it's like based off a 2,000 calorie diet.
2,000 calorie diet. So let's just say, hypothetically, I'm going to use 2,200 calories. By the way, calorie is a measure of energy content. This is considered what's called a food calorie. Food calories are actually, a food calorie is the same thing as a kilocalorie. What does kilo mean? Anybody know? Kilo.
Kilogram, just like a
Yep.
small amount.
Kilo. What number does kilo refer to?
100.
Close. It's 1,000. Okay, so a kilocalorie is equal to 1,000 calories with a little c. So when people who study energy, such as physicists or engineers, in physics, the little calorie is the unit of measure. And 1,000, it's just, there's a lot of, you know, a Big Mac has 535 food calories, okay? So that would be 535,000 calories. So it's those numbers are harder to deal with when dealing with food calories. So we just essentially divided by 1,000 to get a kilocalorie. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. So you need, let's say you need 2,200 calories to basically maintain your weight over the course of the day. Now, where does that energy come from? So let's make a list of let's make a list of things that add up to 2,200 calories in general.
Cereal.
Cereal. What else?
Milk.
I mean, milk,
For the cereal.
orange juice.
Should we go into lunch?
Yeah.
Pizza.
Pizza. Oh my God.
Why not?
Like a
Feel like
tiny
we're in
little sliver of
bunches today.
pizza.
Yeah,
Okay. And how about some veggies? How about some green beans?
I guess so.
Okay. And obviously we'd have to tweak the amounts of these to get them to add up to 2,200. 2,200. It's obviously not much pizza.
No,
Where's dinner?
probably not
Huh?
pizza.
Where's dinner?
Green beans.
That is not gonna fill up me.
A lot of green beans. Pizza.
Yeah, like.
Pizza and green beans. Should we put in a burger?
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's do that for dinner. I'd say it.
I don't know.
So I looked into this a little bit. Let's say you were to eat Big Macs. Anybody know? So a Big Mac is 535 calories, or 5,335 kilocalories.
It's only 500. It's only 500 calories.
535 calories. Big Mac.
Really?
So if you ate 4.1 Big Macs, 4.1 Big Macs, you would meet your energy requirements for the day. Okay, let's break this down a little bit, okay? So where does cereal come from? What is cereal? What is cereal? What kind of cereal? What kind of cereal? Tucker, you said cereal, so give me a cereal.
Let's do Honey Nut Cheerios.
Honey Nut Cheerios.
Why not?
What, old people eat?
Honey Nut Cheerios.
That's not what old
People just eat Cheerios. Okay, what are Honey Nut Cheerios made of? Forget about the honey.
Like wheat.
Is it wheat?
No, it's,
Whole grain oats?
yeah.
Oats. Oats. And oats. Oats are grains. Okay, where do they come from?
The oat farm.
The oat farm. Who's got their Sand County Almanac with them? Anybody?
I do.
Can I see that? Here's the quote. This goes really well. Let me see if I can find it. I love this quote. I posted this on my Facebook stats. all my Facebook friends were like, "Oh no, not Leopold again! You're nuts, man."
Did you get a lot of likes on there?
I got a lot of geeky friends. Okay, I love this quote. Ready? This is actually on page 6. You've probably all gotten this far so far. There are 2 spiritual dangers to not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other that heat comes from your furnace. Don't you love that? I think that's fantastic. Your food doesn't come from a grocery store. That's just happens to be where you pick it up. You really need to know, and I want everybody to appreciate this by the end. It's certainly in a couple of weeks in here, food comes from a farm. And people are growing that food. So Cheerios is processed oats, okay? So there's a farm somewhere. So let's say you get a bowl of Cheerios. You figure how many stalks of oats does that take? I don't know, but a certain amount. And so there's a little piece of land that was exposed to the sunlight that grew those oats that made it into your cereal. So there's a direct connection between a certain plot of land, a certain size of land. The more you eat, the bigger that land gets because you're eating more food. Okay? How about milk? Obviously comes from cows. Well, how do cows make? What do you have to feed cows? Yeah. You feed them, well, now
Or protein.
you either grass feed them, which most people don't, but people are growing more grains to feed the cows to make your milk. So you have another piece of land that you're going to add to that. Orange juice comes from oranges,
Which comes from Florida.
which comes from come from trees. So we're going to add the amount of land that the trees took up. Pizza. Ugh. What's mostly in pizza?
Greece.
Grease. Where's grease come from?
Cheese.
Cheese, it does. Cheese. We're back to the cow. Cheese goes back to you need the milk. What else is in pizza?
Bread.
Tomatoes and bread.
Tomatoes. So we're adding cheese, so we're adding more cow land. We're adding tomato land, and we're adding more wheat because the dough comes from wheat. You've got butter in there, back to the cow.
We're pizza farmers.
Yeast, pizza farmers, wouldn't that be great? Sounds like second grade pizza farm. Pizza trees. Green beans, you gotta grow green beans, there's more land. Hamburgers, oh boy, well, the heck with the milk, you just eat the cow. And that's even more land because you gotta, so
Slaughter.
we've taken those 2,200 and 2,200 calories and we have equated them to a certain land size. Okay. Now, if we were hunters and gatherers, that's how we all started. Okay. None of this fancy agriculture. We basically were going out. Muscadines are in now. Anybody like muscadine grapes? I'm seeing them growing all over the place. So if we were going out and grabbing muscadine grapes and eating those, you'd be a gatherer. That's a gatherer. Or go out and hunt a deer, shoot a deer. That deer needed a certain amount of land. Okay? So if we were just to do a bare minimum, this is how much food I need, this is how much land I need to do that, that is what we talk about when we talk about an ecological footprint. Okay? So I've started off at the bare minimum, just what you eat. All right? But we're not walking around without any clothes on, without any technology, okay? Just wearing, you know, loins, little loincloths from the animals that we killed. Our ecological footprint would be pretty small. However, what this diagram, you know, they made it a footprint, so they made it like, you know, shaped like a foot. But it doesn't have to be. It could just as easily be a square, big squares versus little squares. But what this shows you is that even though everybody has the same caloric needs, it doesn't matter whether you're from China or Israel or France or India or Canada, people basically need the same number of calories on average as other people. So everybody's ecological footprint should be about the same, right? Well, why is it different?
Depends on how much food you can get, how
Well,
much you can grow and distribute.
It's not that much. Yeah, pretty much everyone, it's not food.
is it wealth, money,
Huh?
money?
Money? Yeah, what do you use with money? What do you do with money?
Buy stuff.
Buy stuff. What do you buy? What do people in Haiti buy versus what do people in the United States buy? Buy different buying they buy different things?
I'd say in Haiti as well as in the lower, like Rwanda and India, it'd probably be more so just the essentials that you need in your life: food, water,
Yep.
Basics,
basics, maybe minimal
And then we
clothing.
just buy whatever we
Hmm?
want. I said that we just buy whatever we want.
We just buy whatever we want.
yeah. Ice cream, yeah.
How about the size of your house? Does the size of your house have anything to do with your ecological footprint?
Yes.
Yeah, because if you have a large roof, well, that roof might have plywood in it. That plywood comes from trees. Trees, you add trees to that. How about your cell phone? Does it influence your
Minerals.
minerals? Yep, so if you're mining minerals, you've got to add something more to that. So the more technology you add to your life, if you have synthetic clothes that are made from, say, nylon, nylon is made from petroleum. Petroleum comes out of the earth. There's a certain amount of land that's taken up to get that petroleum out of the ground. So once you start adding more and more stuff, the impact that you make on your surroundings increases. And the problem is that if everybody on Earth had the same ecological footprint as we here have in the United States, you'd need more Earths. We would run out of land. So that tells us that the amount of land that people in the industrialized world, not everybody in the look, so we use the most, 7.2 hectares per person. In France, people in France live about as well as we do, probably, maybe in some ways better. They use much less land, which means they either have efficiencies built into their system, or, yeah.
Oh, I was just, is there a reason why Brazil is so close to the world average? I mean,
Brazil's 2.9 the world
Just
average.
happens to be, yeah, they're just a little bit over the world average.
But I mean,
Why Brazil?
I mean, China, I mean.
Brazil is transitioning from what would be considered a developing country. It used to be very, very poor, but Brazil has come a long way. These are actually called the BRIC countries: Brazil, India, Russia. Is Russia on there?
no.
And China. BRIC. They are countries which are currently transitioning from being fairly underdeveloped, and they're transitioning into being fairly well-developed countries. So as you get more developed, the footprint increases. The main reason, so essentially this is unsustainable, because we're getting more energy than the Earth can supply, and there's a supplement or a subsidy that's being added, and that's basically fossil fuel. So we are adding to our ecological footprint by using fuel that came from the Earth, basically coal, petroleum, and natural gas. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of sessions. So that's just something to keep in mind. Just recognize that everything you do has an environment. It requires a certain amount of energy, and it requires a certain amount of land in order to do that. There's this general. It's sort of written as a formula, but it's not really meant to be calculated per se. And in Chapter 1, when you read the section on population, they're talking about how changes in population size can influence your environmental footprint or your ecological footprint. And that's part of a larger topic called IPAC. Like I say, this is sort of a way to think about environmental problems, not so much a way to calculate something. The I stands for environmental impact. Okay, so these three variables are going to influence how much environmental impact. You can think of environmental impact also as ecological footprint. How much resources, how much you affecting your environment. And since there's no divided by signs here, essentially these are all direct effects. So if any one of these increases, if you were to multiply it out, if this goes up, that goes up. If this goes up, and if any of these increase, then that causes that to increase, right? Because we're multiplying. These are a little multiplication. Okay. The P stands for population. Pretty straightforward. Everybody's eating 4.1 Big Macs a day. You double your population, you double the number of Big Macs, and therefore you double the environmental impact. Make sense? If your cell phone use is always 60% per capita, and your population increases, there's that much more impact. So the more people you have, the more environmental impact you're going to have. But that's not the only thing. It also has to do with how much money you have. If you're on a budget, as practically everybody is, maybe LeBron James is on a budget. I bet he's on a budget too. Everybody needs to be on a budget. But if you're on a tight budget, you got to make sure you pay for food, you pay for your housing, you pay for the essentials. Okay? So you're not out there buying a boat. If you buy a boat, what happens to your ecological footprint?
It grows.
It grows because you got to make the boat from somewhere, from something. You got to use resources. Those resources have to come from somewhere. So once you start getting a little money in your pocket, how many think that the natural human tendency is to put it in the bank and save it? Nah, you're going to spend it. We're conditioned to spend. Didn't used to be that way. We used to be conditioned to save. But people didn't like that because it wasn't all that good for the economy. So once you start getting a little money in your pocket, affluence is just another word for being rich, monetarily rich. So if you have, say, a small population but that's very affluent, it could have the same environmental impact as a larger population that's poor. Make sense? Generally, if you have more money, you buy more stuff. More stuff means bigger ecological impact. T stands for technology. If I heat my home by building a fire in the living room, and I have a chimney, and that's the only way I heat my home, my ecological footprint just has to do with how much wood I have to chop down. But if I have if I'm connected to an electrical system and I'm, you know, getting coal's being burned at a power plant somewhere, okay, that's a step up in technology. And once you start adding all those components, each component has another impact on the environment. Smartphones are a great example of that. Takes a lot to make a smartphone. The components that go into that, a couple supply chains down, somebody's mining a mineral in the Congo at dirt cheap wages to give me the components for my smartphones.